So if there are no questions, then I think it's good at this point to study the actual root text itself, the Songs of Spiritual Experience. So this is, as the title suggests, a condensed form of the stages of path instructions, and it is composed by Jetson Kappa, one of the great masters of Tibet. And due to the condensed and concise nature of the text, then we will try to explore the text with as many examples, anecdotes as possible, because I think time is not really an issue at this point. And if we're able to cover everything, then maybe we might also have the time and opportunity to study other source materials and other textual instructions too. So then, now going on with the Songs of Spiritual Experience, the root text itself, then we notice that the first few verses kind of trace the lineage of the instructions, and it is the kind of customary in Buddhism to kind of offer praises to the Buddha, the subsequent masters. So the first verse is a praise to the Buddha himself. The second verse praises Maitreya and Manjushri, and the third verse praises the classical Indian masters such as Nagarjuna and Asanga. And then the fourth verse praises homage to Atisha Dipankara, the Bengali master, through which these teachings came to Tibet. And then the fifth verse is a form of homage to our particular spiritual teachers or mentors. So then when we talk about the tradition of the spiritual lineage in Buddhism, and in particular in this case Tibetan Buddhism, then there exist many different traditions, such as the Gelug tradition, the Sakya tradition, the Nyingma tradition, and the Kagyu tradition, as well as other traditions such as the Chonam tradition and so forth. So there exists a lot of different spiritual lineages in Tibetan Buddhism. But despite these different lineages, if we trace the source of these lineages and instructions, then the Buddha himself is the ultimate source of these lineages. So the first verse stresses that point. Despite all these different lineages that exist today, the ultimate source of these teachings is the Buddha himself. And then when we talk about the Buddha, then I think it's good at this point to give you like a historical background about the Buddha. Who was the historical Buddha? So in the Buddhist tradition, the story goes that the Buddha was born to an Indian royal household as a prince, and the place where he was born is in today's border between Nepal and India, in a place called Lumbini. And the moment that he was born, it is said that there was a lot of amazing and wondrous signs, such as the fact that immediately when he was born, he began to walk, and he walked in the different directions, 7 steps in 4 different directions, and wherever he walked, there were like flowers that came from his steps.
아니 그런데 신주인들과 집에서는 만나와요. 아니 무슨 것을 가지고 때문에 나이가 이거라. 근데 그런 데 때문에 그들이 지금 공부를 지게 아니 뭐 지난해 맞춤 타와데 그거들 다 참들이 다 다니도 다자가 정선으로 이제 따지치게 정선이 따지치게 위주지 마타와데 아니 그런 그리고 다 참한테 야호요 통 위주셔야 되는데라 아니 기호도 시에다 가르치는 분들이 좀 이제 당과에 가르치는 그다음에 그 집안에 통 많이 빠지고 있어 뭔가 아니 다 제시 좀 아니 콜레지 이제 그거라 아니 최대 쇼에는 최대 이게 책고 있어 근데 되게 가서 집에 뭔가 최대 쇼 자 최소 내가 드리가 나 대통령 내가 뒤치셔야 그런 데 라자를 샤타이도 나 뻔다 라티다니 내가 보이스다 근데 내가 그걸 붙이셔야 되는데 좀 아니 진주가 보고시나 말아 그런 지게 소소소소 지구 대야다 공부로 대야다 근데 나이가 제가 투기하고 내지 좀
So then the story goes that as this small infant grew up into a youthful adult, then unlike other children his age, he showed many uncommon signs, such as not being distracted by the normal things that kids and small children are distracted by. And the story also goes that as it is the custom in those old days that when there is a birth in the royal households, then they consult an astrologer to kind of predict the future of the child or the future of the prince or the princess. So then they called such a sage to the palace to do these predictions. And then when the astrologer, this sage, he saw the child and these uncommon signs that he was showing, then it is said that this astrologer began to weep immediately. And he did so because he could see that this child was very special, and that if he chooses a spiritual path, he will be a supreme teacher who is going to teach this whole world about the nature of reality. And then if he chooses to pursue worldly things, then he will grow up to be a king that will protect the teachings itself, and he will promulgate these teachings. So he was weeping for the fact that as this child will grow up into an adult, he himself, as the sage, will not be alive to see this happen. So it is the story kind of goes like that, and it is mentioned repeatedly that the Buddha, when he was a teenager, a child, that he wasn't really distracted by the normal things that a child or a teenager is distracted by. So then at this point, it is you might be wondering, why are we talking about the Buddha's life at this point? But it is important to talk about the Buddha if we want to understand how we approach things in Buddhism. And it's important to take into account the Buddha's life as an example to cultivate our practices. Yes.
와 지나 this time 내 때문에 다 도도지 지용도 예 그거에 당시에
So then the literature on the Buddha's life itself is very vast, and there exists literature in many different languages, ancient as well as modern. And then in this day and age, I think there are many television series that also depict the Buddha's life and his activities. So for the purposes of these sessions, I'm not going into a great detail, but just to give you a highlight of what the Buddha's life looked like. Yes.
그래서 근데 딱 사실이 아니야. 대지야 친구로 지난 이따 때에 동호회 그 부시나 말아와 이 공부냐에 매저실이 있자. 아니 코랑이 예비 같이 내가 나타나 이제 세상에가 이 코랑 지시 좀 주주에 내가 근데 이제 아니 지시로 이다 바로 지금 연중도 동해도 통화줘야 되는 이제 제가 나도 봐샤 안 나도 무슨 좀 같은 게 지금 강의 치료 통화도 이제 도시나에 아니 lembola solution to my channel or a person so but I will see the sub and the kaji manji chane yuna mena samatin sha ani koran ta de ji ko je ro de je ba zamza shuru la pe pe yu sa ta ani pe ma ju ga ya ro ba de ta ta pa shi ga ta sa je yam de la ro de to ko de yo ba de nyam do na ani shi da de shi shuru zamza pe ya yu sa.
So then as this kid showed a sort of a spiritual bent, and then along with the astrologer's predictions, then the king had a sense of concern that this prince would not really look after the kingdom and would not take after him after he passes away. So then the king took the decision that he's going to bring up this prince in the shelters of the palace itself. He's not going to expose him to the outer realities or the outer world itself, because he was very worried that because he displayed a spiritual inclination that he's going to forsake the kingdom and go to be a hermit or something. And so he didn't really face the outer realities of human existence. He was brought up in a very sheltered environment where he didn't see the suffering of the general public. But then the Buddha was, but this prince, he was always very inquisitive, and he always wanted to explore the outside world. So there came a point wherein the king had to let him out, and so then the king kind of let him out with the condition that he was going to be accompanied by this horse rider or this charioteer, and he's not going to like walk about normally, but he's going to be led around the kingdom in that chariot with the horse rider. Yes.
근데 잠자 그러시도 비리라 때 바레도 따다 되는 대마치를 갖고 오는 아니 수로를 아니 저기가 아니 미 예반이 통과 이 예반에 통다 보네 지금 미래에 에디트 참아서 한번 되게 미워서 미지 나라에 기간이 나요도 비리지가 딱 거는 인주제나 거는 인주제나 거라 대마치를 안에 비리지가야 gengo들이 가지고 주로도 스포냐 타고 또 안다디 개비도 비서 네 아니 대마치를 나라에 비리지가 아니다 야스가 다가 우리 조류의 신강 키도로 신의 지금 맞고 위시 자도 근데 아니 근데 다 토마토를 치야기 의미입니다. 제가 말해 더 나와다 이거 치워 그래서 근데 이제 딱 맞아 거하더라 정식 거하더라 디스플레이 하지도 좀 있다 비나도 근데 이제 딱 맞아 지금 취지치고 상관이 내가 한번 제가
So then as he was being charioted around by this horseman, then he began to notice different things. Then he saw a sickly person and that no one was touching. And then when he saw that, he asked the horse rider, "What is this? What happened to this person?" And then the horse rider explained to him that this is a sickly person, bedridden with disease. And then he realized that this is something that he had to go through too as a human being. And then at another turn, then he saw someone who was bent over with old age. So when he saw that, then he realized that he also had to suffer that if he reaches his old age. Old age is something that he had to go through too. And then, as is the custom in Indian tradition, when someone passes away, they prepare a bed of wood, and they like kind of perform the funeral rites by carrying him over through the town. So when he saw that, then he realized that in the end, all of us have to part away from this world, that death is an imminent thing. So as he noticed these three things, then there was a sense of true renunciation that developed in the Buddha, that in this existence we have to go through the suffering of aging, sickness, and death. So this is something that none of us are free from as soon as we are born. So he developed a true sense of renunciation at that moment. Yes. So then, even when he was a prince and all of his needs are met in the palace, so when he saw these things, he had a true sense of renunciation, and he has a sense of dissatisfaction with the kind of material comfort that he had in the palace. This is a very strange thing, because normally when everything that we want and all our needs are met, then we do not really think far ahead. But the Buddha, when he saw these three things in the market by chance, then he felt that all of these material comforts and needs that are being met in the palace were very temporary, and that he felt like the true suffering like we have to go through, every one of us. So he really felt a sense of renunciation, that he felt a determination to be free from these sufferings of life. So then, even though he married and he had a child, a prince was born to him, he took the decision one day to run away from the palace and forsake all his kingdom. And he ran away with the same horsemen, and they crossed the river into the jungle. And then, as a prince, of course, he had a lot of things to, like ornaments and so forth, to wear. So he gave all of that back to the horsemen, and then he crossed the river and cut his own hair, taking the vow that now he will pursue spirituality that offers a chance to be free from this suffering. Yes. So then, as he took this decision to be a spiritual adept, then as he ran away from the palace and lived a life of a spiritual adept, then he relied on many different masters and teachers of his time, but he felt a dissatisfaction with the teachings for the fact that they did not offer a way to be free from suffering. So then he took it upon himself to meditate on the nature of reality by meditating continuously for 6 years in the nearby area of Bodh Gaya. So during those times, he took the decision to not consume too many foods, and he lived a very spare and Spartan life during these 6 years. Yes. So then it is said that after meditating for a while, then he meditated under the Bodhi tree at what is called Bodh Gaya. There is a pilgrimage site, and now there are many historical interpretation of where the real place lies, but it is generally accepted that it was that under that particular Bodhi tree that the Buddha gained enlightenment. And after 6 years of meditation. So when the Buddha gained enlightenment, what do we mean? Then he became what we call the actual Buddha, the teacher that we revere. So at this point, it is important to understand what exactly did he gain when we say he achieved enlightenment, or what exactly, how did this prince became the Buddha in that instance. So it is said that when someone becomes a Buddha, someone awakens from that deep slumber of delusion and afflictive emotions. And when they awaken from that, then they see the nature of reality as it is. And then along with that, they accumulate all the perfect qualities of the mind. So with these two, then someone is said to have achieved enlightenment, or someone is said to have become a Buddha. Yes. Yes. So then it is said that after the Buddha gained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, then he remained in silence in meditative equipoise for the next 49 days without refusing to teach this thing that he has now come to understand. And the reason why he didn't want to teach immediately is because he said, there's a verse which says that I have found a truth that is like nectar, but this truth would not be easily appreciated and understood by people. So this is why I choose to remain in silence rather than teach. So he remained in silence, and he was reticent to teach this dharma, or this truth that he had found, to people. But after that, then he began to receive requests from many people to actually teach him. So then it is said that the first teaching he gave, the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, to the 5 ascetics who were his spiritual friends before in Varanasi. So the reason that the Buddha didn't want to teach is because he had come to realize the wisdom of emptiness, the emptiness of reality itself. So this kind of truth, if it is immediately taught like that, then people have an adverse reaction to it. People are not able to understand and appreciate it. So this is the reason why he took the time not to teach. And when he did teach, he taught the teaching of the Four Noble Truths first. Yes. So then when he gave his first teaching, this teaching is known as the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So in this teaching, he talked about the the truth of existence, and from a very experiential basis through the lens of suffering. So then he said, these four noble truths are the truth of suffering, then the truth of the origin of suffering, then the truth of cessation of this suffering, and then the truth of path. Yes. So then when the Buddha chose to give these teachings, it was not a random teaching that he decided to give. There is a lot of thought that went into, and there is a lot of purpose to giving this particular teaching as his first teaching. So when we look at the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, then in these four simple truths, he highlights how we become engaged in samsaric existence through this cycle of suffering. Then he also offers us a path, a way out of this suffering. So then this fact is appreciated when we look at the way that the Four Noble Truths were taught in this particular order. So when we say that the Buddha taught the truth of suffering first, and then the truth of the origin of the suffering, then through the causal, chronological order, maybe he should have talked about the origin of suffering first, but he didn't do so. He talked about the truth of suffering first in order to help us identify what suffering really is. So when we talk about the truth of suffering, then it's generally understood that our existence is always beset by suffering. Existence itself in samsara is suffering. And then what do we mean by that? That as soon as we take birth, we are bound to, as human beings, we are bound to suffer through the sufferings of aging, sickness, death, and birth also itself is a form of suffering. So this is the kind of suffering that as human beings, whatever race we belong to, status we have to suffer through these. So then, when he taught about the truth of suffering, then he taught us that there are generally three types of suffering in samsara, and then these three types of suffering are the suffering of change, then the suffering of suffering itself, and then the suffering of what we call conditional, pervasive conditioning. Yes. So then, when we talk about these three types of suffering that the Buddha taught, then when we look at the suffering of suffering, then what do we exactly mean by suffering of suffering? So as soon as we take birth, or as soon as we begin to exist as sentient beings, then we are beset by suffering. This is a fact. But then, as a reaction to these suffering, then we begin to suffer more. For example, as we are born as human beings, then we go through sensory feelings of pain, harm, and so forth. So all of these are suffering of suffering.
배나 남시 참 진짜 되는 아니 마셔서 그러나 찍고 해서 아니 마셔서 되라 내가를 해 찍으러 니만 가서 되셔 나한테 두고야 눈이 차다 세상 줄을 두기를 아무 카드 받는 거들에 내와 있는 거 진짜야 지어리 부터 되다 많이 이게 뭐죠 네 줄을 두기에
So then the second type of suffering, the Buddha taught it to be the suffering of change. So what we think is a source of joy, source of happiness, source of pleasure, does not remain like that all the time. So for example, these kind of change into suffering, what we think to be pleasure, joy and happiness, in one instant actually changes in the next instant into a source of suffering for us. For example, in this heat, as we stay under this fan or under AC, then we feel like we have some respite from the heat now. We feel a sense of joy, a sense of pleasure that we are under this fan. But then as we stay under the fan for too long, then we begin to feel a little bit cold. When the AC is on full blast, then we begin to feel cold. Then we begin to feel irritated again. So this is the way, like in samsara, like what we perceive to be pleasure, joy and happiness does not remain like that. It begins to change. And also, the opposite is true when we look at someone who lives in a very cold area. Then we feel like, if the sun comes out for a little bit, if I can bathe in the sun for a little bit, then it will be really good. So as you stay in the sun for a long period of time, then you begin to suffer sunburn. You begin to you don't want to stay in the sun anymore. You want to come back into the shade. So all of these are examples of suffering of change.
So getting all these also part of suffering of change, right? It's like the fact that nothing is permanent and everything changes over time.
그래, 로가드레저라 제가 나치를 가와디아니 주에 동료로지를 맞으시는 되게래서.
그리 너무 지우대. 다 지를 등에는 너무 지우로 있어야지. 지우도 그리 그냥 눈이 차.
So then the actual process of aging, can we say that somebody actually begins to enjoy the actual process of aging? Not really. So when we're talking about suffering of change, then there's a sense of enjoyment first, and then that changes into suffering. So then a more appropriate example would be like say that we say, if I am able to accumulate wealth, then I'll be so happy. So once you accumulate that health, then there's a lot of headache in maintaining that kind of wealth or material possession. Then it's not such a happy endeavor at all. What you thought would be something good, joyful, in the end turns to be a source of suffering, more tension, more stress. So these are the kind of examples of suffering of change. Yes. So in this group, I noticed that not many of you are wearing jewelry and so forth, but in but Tibetan people, they like to put on a lot of jewelry, gold, precious stones, when they so then it's kind of a status symbol in Tibetan society. So then in Tibetan we give this example that you feel like when you get these things for yourself, these precious stones and these gold earrings and so forth, you might feel like, if I get these things, I'll be really happy. But then once you get these things for yourself, then there's this added tension of like, if I go out, I might get robbed. And then if I do not take care of these things, then they might get destroyed. So there's always like more like source of tension, more stress for you once you begin to accumulate these things for yourself. So these are the examples of suffering of change. Yes. So maybe a more relatable example for you as a group would be the kind of fascination we have with the latest phones. So let's say like the 13, the 14, the 15 for iPhones and so forth. I don't have like these kind of phones, but I have noticed my cousins, they are really fascinated with the latest model of the iPhone or so forth. So then when we look at that, then we begin to understand how like what we hold to be something joyful, something that can offer us happiness, doesn't really remain so. Once you get the latest phone, then you feel like for a few moments you feel there's a duration of time when you feel like nobody has this. But once other people begin to have the same phone, then you have to now look for the next model. So there is always a sense of competition, sense of greed, sense of attachment. Then there's this added stress of like, I have to be really careful with this phone because I might lose it. So there's more attachment and so forth. Yes.
So based on the suffering of change, is it then wrong to have these pleasures, or can you have these pleasures with a different perspective? So, for example, I do like stones and jewelry. I normally do wear more jewelry, not for status, but I like wearing it. However, I do notice that when I buy a rock that I really like, for example, it takes an extra, mental bandwidth to safe keep it. But I then decided that I will buy it, but with less attachment to it. So if I were to lose it, I'm not going to get too miserable by the loss of it. So have it as a possession, but also not be so attached to it.
근데 그럼 제가 드리도 네 타기가 저기다 주례 동네 숨어서 기스 주례 동네에 된지는 왜 이게 나스라 네 다 주디 네 드라마다 이시그러스 주례 동네 주디 다 나는 좀 배셔야돼서 봐 아니면 또 가봐도 리칭이 또 쓰라서 오샤라스 그런 게르도 있는 리칭이 도로라 도린신데 마볼 근데 구두치에 가고 했으라 뒤치는데 zamba니 당보랑 도나 중소서 가서 시험하는 시간이라 디 구두치도 좀 요도 좀 봐라 셈나가 셈접 태워도 오지 요도스 이나야 그런 게 될라 니 차고 싶신 못 맞이네라 딘데기 따단도 신이 딜라 냐르 딜라 롱추치나 니 눈이 주지 너무서 주기 어려워 말이스
근데 기다린 것을 가득 따는 그 라디 되어야 나한테 저는 이거도 배 자치고 있나 사바 숨어가 사바는 거를 이제 사 그래서 숨어가 근데 이따도 저 계속 저는 이거도 배 자치고 있나 그냥 나와 샤이와 있나 그냥 이미지 수로도 들어서는 이 주로도 저는 마치고 샤이 되는 꼬마리아 디키야 신경 먹어요 얘 그런 게 디키라도 더도 그런 가요 질레 잘라디기 얘 무슨
So then when we look at this example and when you shared your personal inclination to buy stones and collect stones, so let's stick with that example. So then it's a form of material possession, we understand that. So there is already a sense of attachment that you want a material possession for yourself, even though it does not constitute a non-virtuous act in itself. But there is the element of attachment. So once that element of attachment is there, then the way you relate to that object of attachment, this is the process in which we begin to lose our freedom, so to say. So for example, you bought these stones, you collected these stones, and then you did it with the best sense of detachment as possible. But once you have this, you have a sense of accomplishment. You have this for yourself. This is okay so far. Now you have to save up to buy more stones. then you have to protect and safeguard all these stones that you have collected so far. So in that process, what is happening to your mental process? It's being constricted and being confined to these material possessions all the time. So in this sense, we lose our true sense of freedom in the way the mind thinks. Yes. So now to explore this idea to its full extent, let's say now you have a box full of collection of stones. Then you are not in a position to now carry this with you because you're traveling about. And now you have this stress now. What am I going to do with this box of stones? And now if you want to keep it here in Dharamsala, then you have to look around for people who you can trust. And then you begin to think, can I really trust this person with this? And what will happen? So many stress, questions, doubts. And this is what we call a conceptual elaboration, wherein we begin to impose like our own fears, doubts onto the situation. And this is where suffering comes from. No? Yes.
So I'm trying to understand this kind of suffer change. It refers more to the fear of the change or the change itself. Let's stick with the jewelry example. Like it's the suffer from the fear of losing it more than actually losing it and then suffer.
But then when you lose it, there is suffering too. So in the change, there is fear before it begins to change, and when it changes, there is suffering in both instances. But we think that this is something good. This can offer me joy, pleasure, and happiness, but it's not the case all the time. I will translate to her. Moi lamna tanda nga zo jure dungi la jura. Di ni samudang yundu zambasra. Ni tang jura. Majur mo ni jur yung sami ki jikwa jingna juras. Di zo di juni shigi res. Ngai lana di chani jala yung sigirisra. Majur mo ni ngamra ki jingna jura. Di jur sana yang dungi jura.
Is it also related to people? To relationship with people?
Ni titanda ki ngazu jure dungi la jura. Mi khansa da khansa pa ki dewa jura. Tela yana ni samadang ayo res. So in that sense, yes, we can extend it to our relations as well with people, because people change, and people we think we can confide in, we can like put our trust in, it is the case that it does not remain so after a while. So then the third type of suffering is what is called the pervasive suffering of conditioning. So this is the suffering of samsara, or suffering of existence itself, wherein as soon as we take birth, we are bound to suffer. As soon as we take birth in any form of a sentient being, then we are bound to suffer. So this is the suffering of pervasive conditioning. And now Buddha gave his teaching about the Four Noble Truths, he made it the point that he would talk about the truth of suffering first, in order to help us recognize and identify suffering for ourselves. So now when we talk about these three types of suffering, it's important to recognize their nature and understand that things that we hold to be a source of joy are in actuality source of suffering for us. So this is important. And now when we notice that, then just a basic recognition of the truth of suffering is not enough. Now the question arises, can we find a way to free ourselves or liberate ourselves from these sufferings? And when that question arises, then we need to look at the origin of these suffering. Where do these suffering come from? So this question arises. And so that when this question arises, then only then the Buddha gave the teaching about the truth of the origin of suffering. Yes. So then, as we learn the truth of suffering and the truth of origin of the suffering, then the question arises: how can we actually start to stop our suffering? How to stop ourselves from suffering? And then, when this question arises, then we arrive at the truth of the cessation of our suffering. Yes.
I get quite a grasp of suffering of pervasive suffering.
Pervasive conditioning.
Conditioning. But when I see these words in a literal sense, I think of the words conditioning and how that leads us to suffering. But I don't know if that's what you're trying to express.
단단한서 차고 두지기 동일해 줘라. 차고 두지기 동일해 다 인진나로 주르는데 좀 차블라도 좀 상마 차블 주르 주라. 두지에라도 좀 군속이 만서 진로지가 샤다 인진나가. 진담인다 주라. 내담다 진담인다 지니 니 수두니 중교에 와도 시에 주라. 아니 단다 코어가 되는 지리기도스 주르라 다니라. 아니 차고 두지기 동일하는 디시마 참으로 지잖아라. 뭐 십사오잖아. 코어가 되지 So then your understanding or your reading into in the way that this is translated when we say suffering of pervasive conditioning is quite accurate when we say that pervasive in the sense that it's everywhere, and then conditioning in the sense that from outer conditions, inner conditions, these suffering arises. But if we are really being strict, then from my personal interpretation, I understand it to mean that pervasive meaning that as soon as you take birth, it naturally follows, it is necessary that you have to go through these sufferings of birth, aging, death, and sickness. So this kind of suffering is pervasive and necessary, right? So this is what we mean by pervasive conditioning. Now if we are being even more strict from the dialectician's point of view in the Buddhist tradition, then we say that it is pervasive because from the peak of samsaric existence, let's say the God realm, to the depth or of the hell. So these are the two extremes of samsara, the highest point in samsara and the lowest depth of hell. So as soon as you are born in samsara, even if you are up there or down there, it is necessary you have to suffer through these. So of course, as a dialectician, then one begins to debate a lot about these things. So then, when we say that a dialectician, a Buddhist dialectician would debate when this kind of interpretation is offered, then it is in the sense that if this is the pervasive conditioning, the suffering of pervasive conditioning, then how do you begin to explain the fact that an infant, at the moment he is born, survives only for a few minutes and dies? Then where did he begin to suffer old age and sickness and so forth? So these are the kind of debate procedures that happens. But without being too strict like that, we can take it to mean that this is the general kind of suffering that is pervasive in all samsara, all forms of samsara.
So this is different from suffering itself.
Yes.
Because suffering itself is the sensory experience of
Yes. More about the reaction to suffering. Our ideas, our experience of pain, pleasure, and so forth. So then let's try to relate to these teachings by thinking about our own personal experiences. So I will start myself. When I think about the suffering of suffering, then the fact that I had to part away from my country and from my family from Tibet is a suffering. That it is the nature in this samsara that every meeting has a parting. And it's just a matter of time before this happens. So it might happen that due to specific conditions, I had to part away from them. So now, on top of that, as I came to this foreign land, I had the trouble of adjusting to the climate, to the diet. So this is the suffering of suffering. So this is the way that I think about it. So maybe you can try to relate to your own personal experiences, and then try to maybe share on it. So then, let's hear it from all of you. Try to relate it to a personal experience and see, like, what type of suffering was it? So then, as we are now together in this group, feel free that we know each other now at this point, so don't be hesitant that what I say will not really be appreciated or so forth. So as spiritual friends, we have to do away with hesitation and shyness and so forth. Because if we stand to gain something, if someone gains to benefit from it, then we should try to share our experience with people.
Suffering, for example, for me it was, I wanted to study since the beginning, but it took me 20 years. This was suffering of suffering.
Can you repeat that?
Yes. An example, I'm trying to think, example of suffering. I wanted, since I became a nun, I wanted to study in depth, like Tibetan philosophy and all. But it took me 20 years to come here, meaning that
let's explore suffering of suffering first. Tanda Kurangi Dunye la jura, ti samadang yung desamba, Kurang rang samadang na lo mambong mo ne lo nishu sume ne ra, nangshu ki tarup, peji nangdengi riba, la tonang yus ra, ine da ma ting sabu jambu samne tagdu zaman ne gulung yuna yang sra, tanda budu gor ras, tanda budu tagu yung gor goye jumze jura, ine gor joye ki riba di Kurang ne Dunye ki Dunye ra uchi tongi dos.
I guess, okay, go ahead.
No, you go because you think.
Sure. I would say that I hope it fits this category, but I was a young teenager that was raised in a very small town in the middle corner of Africa, in a small bubble that was very different from the rest of the world. And I had to move to the US, and I ended up in San Francisco, a huge city in the US, at a time when I was still trying to find myself as a teenager. And my entire definition of self-worth or who I should strive to become, I felt like I didn't know anything and I was starting from zero. And I had to relearn everything I knew. And I think that was, very, very difficult period of my life that I think may have shaped a lot of my thinking today. But I hope that's an example of suffering. The lack of familiarity of your space and culture become, and just realizing that everything you were taught could be false is quite a painful experience, I think.
Tini Kurangi nyamnyongro di shinasra, ni tadi Dunye ki khonsu kigemen hagu dusra. Ina Kurang salon chisa di Afrika ki trong di chunju jina la salon cheta. Tidi zamba tongja te tujala di shirayu kumara. Ni rishung tadi di chunju jina ku jizo chunju jina ya salon chiris. Ina da dine ma ari la pa pedo. Ari la pedo zamba San Francisco la di jasa chimbo chi wayurda. Dila hop de mende de zamba ni Dunye shuk chimbo Dunye la ne halota. Kani shuk chimbo chesos. Kajanda umene kuryu pe chunju jina la ni nangsa dawara pigina. Hop de pigile de zamba mi damenda yejo. Ni rishung suzo nam yundu ne paja da umchi yejo ni rishung di da thara mucha. Ticha de zamba ni suzo su yimbe surela ya tiwa shuk chimbo. Suzo ki mola tiwa shuk chimbo. Ligiyora. Ni chezanda pajo ki rishung pajo ki dodang de la kelen chema to ni dawochi. Yang suzo ki rishung de la yang thara mucha yoro. Tinde cha de zamba kani shuk chimbo chasos.
I'm not sure I understand. I thought that suffering mean that something happened, then I dwell into it, so I suffer more. Because is that right or
And so, when we're talking about suffering of suffering, then there is, of course, from one part, an element of dwelling upon it, and then suffering mentally. But then, when like more suffering piles on to like the initial suffering, then it's suffering of suffering. So maybe if I share one, it becomes clear. When I was young, I was a very angry kid. And I used to get into a lot of fights. And I was very easily irritated. And I was not in the good books of the teachers or my fellow students. And there was one moment when I began to realize how foolish this was. And it was when I saw the way I reacted to something very small. There is a cupboard, and the cupboard's, what do you call it? The door of the cupboard blew, and it hit me right on the top of my head, and I was like not in a good mood. So what I did was punch the door of the cupboard again. Then that moment I realized like maybe the way you react causes something, like, you know, for you, or creates more tension, creates more suffering for you at that moment. So when I think about suffering of suffering, I think it's like that. Your reaction to something compiles like more suffering for you. So we share.
I can give an example. I have a physical condition that is a chronic physical condition, and I mean it took a long time to be diagnosed and everything, and I think I suffered physically, and I suffered a lot of that emotionally as well, and then I suffered from feeling sorry for myself that I have that instead of actually accepting it, which made everything worse, and it also influenced the physical aspect of that, like the mental obviously impacted the physical as well. So I think for years I kind of just built the suffering of just focusing on that way too much instead of accepting that it is what it is and what can I actually do to make it better instead of just dwelling. So I'm sharing the dwelling part, or dwelling on how horrible it is.
Tadagi kurangi tagara chirogu dizambayra. Ini dunya la dizamba dunya jik chungne ra tigola samu tang dina sem nam kanya mambash digi duas. Di dunya la mazi chigi isra. Ta nganzo ki tezam do mare la edi nganzo sebu chasa asta. Ini tanda kurangi share di dir kurang la tanda subugi nazar rochi isra. Ini subu nazar di ta pechen chöda kabolo isra. Juno ne nadi ejir isra. Ini di dizamba tangbo da neda di tuen yung dizamba ni neba naza diri la ni ta chue mura. Di yung dizamba susu ki kiela ma tuye jura. Muilen chi ma tuye jura. Ini di go la sama mambo shiu tang sho rida. Di tang sho rida ngada dinde yung mi siwa rila kielen chi ma tuye jura. Di go la sama mambo tang yung dizamba sama di kurangi kanye chik chagira. Kanye digi yang tandung subugi nedang dila jun shuk chia tingda. Ini dinde sama tang yung dizamba di dunya roji la mazi chik tang dos.
그래서 네 무대기 내가 요인 차이차이 배셔 보이는 게 근데 내가 요인은 좀 딜해요. 아주 주주기 치지 장사. 근데 주스 있는 데는 내가 지시. 근데 주스 있는 데는 내가 지시. something right. 기타는 이제 이 차이 나서기 그런 기분은 준 거지 말고 네 몸으로 주고 봐. 저런 나서 다가라만 있는 민다 만나죠. 상담 다친 나서 이런 거 봐. 지카레 내지 그 배가 되지. 가서 문제 배경에서 가지고 있는데 나서지 왜 이봐. 내 수수게 가시면서도 나서기 여러 가지가 무슨 수차로 이 차지. 그 아니들 책책 나서 이 먹어요. 근데 그 나서 몇 번 나시 거라이지. 전에 내가 제 아니지 칼라사나 왜 아무런 된 나서 미니들의 포체링이 돼. 아시가 나서 매선 가지고 이제 가지고 미안 좀. 이제 나서 이 삼수 잡자제 요리에 대해서 한번 해야 돼. 그래서 이 하고 해야 돼. 그래서 이제 빵나야 붙이고 하마고 나서 네가 또 뭐지 로이니까 이제 하고 해야 돼. 네가 무슨 제거해 줘. 미처럼 집이 쉬고라 쉬고야 되나 집안. 그래서 이 가도 가득 해야 돼. 최대 지기까지
Yes. So then, as you shared, then this constitutes what we call a suffering of suffering. Now, when you share this with us, then when you have this condition, then it's helpful to remind ourselves of the words that we discussed at the start of this retreat, Shanideva's words, that if something can be remedied, why worry about it? And if something cannot be really remedied, then why worry about it? So when you look at this, then we begin to appreciate the teachings and the implication these teachings have. So I as you already said, that when you mentally start to stress over this, then it has a detrimental physical effect on your condition. So from this, you understand the importance of these kind of mental attitudes we need to adopt. So as human beings, all of us go through suffering of disease and so forth. So for example, but it depends on the way we approach it mentally. This has a huge impact on the improvement or the way this condition deteriorates. So, for example, in the nunnery, there are many nuns who do not know that they have like particular diseases, but during this random health checkups, then they come to know that they have these diseases. But they do not have this kind of reaction wherein they begin to stress and become depressed and become discouraged because they have these conditions. And they just go about their lives normally, taking the doctor's advice about what kind of things they need to adopt and incorporate into their life, and what kind of things that they need to kind of do away with. Following this direction, then they go about their life normally. And there are many cases wherein like people who are diagnosed with serious conditions actually live longer than people who are not diagnosed at all with these kind of conditions. This is because mentally they are able to kind of accept this and approach it better. So it's useful to kind of remind ourselves of the teachings in these moments.
I do have to say that 2 years ago I did decide to just accept it, and I feel much better.
Lonnis when the Kuram when Melenchi to some Kelenchi to some sra, and she's on the Simba Chibotus. So yes, following the doctor's directions about what to adopt, what not to do, that's the best we can do.
I have to disagree, but that's a completely different conversation.
Okay. Yeah. That maybe we break for tea. We pick up the question in the next session. It's question answer time.